For all the very high acclaim that Carlos Kleiber received when this recording of him conducting Wagner's Tristan und Isolde appeared in 1982, the matter of the recording's completion and release had been a highly fraught issue. And for those who were involved in the complications and difficulties, it was something of a climax to what was for them a history of sometimes very strenuous relationships with Kleiber. His immense demands, his extreme sensitivity, and for all his genius, his innate fragile insecurity. These were some of the reasons that Carlos Kleiber had the reputation of being one of the most challengingly difficult of all artists to deal with. For his audiences, the reputation was compounded by what appeared to be his inaccessibility, certainly since he had risen to fame in the 1970s. There were very few appearances, just a very few recordings, and he refused to give any interviews. There had only ever been one interview back in 1960, and that was when he was only very early into his career. And so there were no conventional media profiles, other than journalists' efforts to put together recollections and comments from people who had worked with him, or in the case of a very few people, those who had got to know him in some kind of personal capacity. He was indeed reclusive, but in fact he was not unapproachable. Unlike most conductors of his very high fame, there was no entourage to protect and represent him and therefore create something of a barrier for those people who wanted to speak with him. There wasn't even an agent or a manager, other than the engaging management of an orchestra or an opera house on the occasions when he was conducting. And for those of us who were so privileged to work with him, he was actually easier to approach and speak to informally and directly than the majority of, shall we say, big-time conductors of his generation. Provided, though, that you didn't try and get too close to him. Those who did were shut out by him very quickly and very abruptly. Just a very few people did get to know Carlos Kleiber, and that happened when he wanted to know them. Those who were the chosen few found him a captivating extension of the truly astonishing person as well as artist that those of us who were so immensely fortunate to be making music with him had experienced in his uniquely inspirational rehearsals. And one of the very, very few people, possibly the only person, who developed a regular contact with him other than his wife and children, did so without ever meeting him. Charles Barber and Carlos Kleiber were letter-writing pen friends.
I decided that I wanted to study with Carlos Kleiber. So I mentioned that to my teacher and he laughed. And he said, "Oh, Charles, don't get your hopes up. No one studies with him. He doesn't work all that often. And you might be terribly disappointed. Please don't get your hopes up. I don't think it's possible even to reach him. I don't think he has an agent." And that turned out to be true. But that certainly didn't stop me. So I got in touch with Ron Wilford at Columbia Artists in New York, and through his secretary, Carolyn Weber, asked whether or not she had Carlos' address. And she said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "I don't suppose you could give it to me." And she said, "No, of course not." And I said, "Okay. But if I wrote him a letter asking to study with him and work for him as some kind of apprentice, would you be willing to pass it on for me?" And she said, "Yes, I can do that. But please, Dr. Barber, don't get your hopes up. Often as not, he doesn't even reply to our letters. He simply doesn't work in that way." I thanked her for that and set about writing a letter. And ordinarily words come quickly and letters are fast, but I struggled with this one for some while because it occurred to me that there must be a reason why this most extraordinary conductor never had a student. And surely that might have something to do with the overcapacity of students, myself included, to spend most of our time on knee pads worshiping the sacred idol. And it was really clear from watching his performances that Kleiber had an enormous sense of humor, very, very potent and penetrating and sometimes caustic was this sense of humor. And if that was correct, then it was probably also correct that when people wrote him letters like that, They probably all suffered from this common affliction, this reflux of self-interest. And he was no doubt turned off and horrified by this kind of thing. So I decided instead to write him a funny letter and to make it, I hoped, interesting, certainly self-deprecating, and altogether like no other letter he ever received from someone like me, an unknown conducting student in California. So I finally finished the letter and I put it in the mail. 2 weeks later, I got a reply. Clearly, the strategy had had some success. Caroline Weber had kept her word. She sent the letter to him, and he replied and said, in 2 pages, in hand, no. And went on to say, I've never had a student. I wouldn't know what to teach them. I don't have a degree in music. Perhaps you should teach me. I'm sorry, but no. And the letter was like that for 2 pages, funny as hell, very direct and personal, with no return address. And nonetheless, I took from the letter in my ever optimistic way that if I wrote again, he might reply. I did, and he did. Those letters went through Caroline Weber for, I think, perhaps the first 6 or 7 months. And then one day, without saying a word about it, his letter came back and he had home stamped an address. Do you remember those John Bull printing presses that we children used to use when growing up? His home address stamp looked like it had come out of one of those things. It was absurd and funny, and as I certainly came to learn, ever so typical. So thereafter, I wrote to him at his home address, which I pledged solemnly, but in a silly way, perhaps, that I would keep a secret. And so it went for 15 years.
Nein, das kann nicht sein, denn nach der 7 kommt erst die 8.
Sie haben mich ganz verwirrt gemacht, wir wollen wechseln.
Wechseln?
Den Strang des Herzens in den See und ich
This music, Johann Strauss's operetta Die Fledermaus, was one of the many topics that Carlos Kleiber and Charles Barber corresponded about.
The most remarkable thing that I recall at this stage was his insistence that the Czardas represented a work of genuine, heartfelt loneliness and despair, and that my previous effort to treat it as a gesture of some satire and perhaps even sarcasm, at the expense of the personality, was entirely wrong and misplaced. And he insisted that I understand it instead as a song of some great moment and despair. He was really quite adamant about that, and he offered evidence for it. I was really taken by that, and in the course of it, reconsidered my own view of it, and our production changed accordingly. I tried really hard not to parrot or imitate his recording, and it was typical of Carlos that he recommended another recording altogether, Clemens Krauss. He didn't want me to listen to his recording, but he thought Clemens Krauss had a better command of the material. Well, indeed, the Krauss recording is wonderful, but Carlos is unique.
As Prince Orlovsky's gala fancy dress party gets underway, Rosalinda Eisenstein appears disguised as a voluptuous Hungarian countess, with the purpose, achieved very quickly, of discovering her husband's philandering at the very same party. To convince some doubters about her identity, she sings a Hungarian Czardas. Sounds of my homeland, you awaken my longing, call forth tears to my eyes. When I hear you, you songs of home, you draw me back to you, my Hungary. O homeland so wonderful, how clearly the sun shines there. How green your forests, how laughing the fields, O land where I was so happy. The combination of wistful reflection and brilliant humour in Die Fledermaus appealed most greatly to Carlos Kleiber, and especially as the humour is sometimes very subtle and sometimes rather zany. That was a key to one side of Kleiber's personality.
For those who understood the necessity of humor in Carlos' life, the absolute necessity of it as a protective shield, then they ran perhaps a lesser risk of inadvertently setting him off. And those who were simply speechlessly in awe of the man would perhaps more often than in any ordinary relationship get the back of his hand, because by and large he did not generally wish to engage with people who did not share his alertness of wit.
We became very good friends, and we had lots of laughs, and he was always up for some sort of prank or another, apart from being extremely serious.
He had an enormous sense of humor, and the kind of humor that I cherish, because you were working like a dog and you were trying so hard at such excruciating detail sometimes, and blocking rehearsals and staging and getting this right and repeating and so forth. And yet there was always this atmosphere of joy on your work and joy in your work. And I'll never forget that atmosphere.
He used to send faxes to the office, signed Carlos Kleiber. Wow, hey, how cool is that? And he wrote such funny things. He said, I'd do anything for you except conduct or be on your chat show. And jokes in all languages, and he'd send cartoons and, tell me how to treat I was always moaning about my daughter, I expect, going through some crisis or other.
Dame Felicity Lott was Carlos Kleiber's chosen Marschallin when he conducted Richard Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier at the Vienna State Opera in 1994. She was thrilled to be one of the few people to receive letters from him. He always used to address her as the role's full title, Die Feldmarschallin. Well, kind of.
Dear Feldmarschmallowin. Sure, I got the wonderful postcard from my two Herz allerliebsten, quinine and merry trees. Because Anne-Sophie and I must have sent him a postcard from somewhere or other. It irks me that you succumb to agents' pleas. It's that I feel cheated when you go around singing our war horse all over the place when I'm barely looking the other way. Heut und morgen und der übernächsten Tag. No matter what the so-called professionals say, every single performance removes some of the valuable varnish, the venerable veneer, the spiffing spontaneity, the orgiastic originality, the intrinsic insight, the subliminal splendour, the elementary edge, the uncanny undertone, the shiny shimmer, the... What the hell was I going to say when I started this sentence? So amazing to get these letters.
Well, the Anne-Sophie that Dame Felicity Lott was mentioning before was Anne-Sophie von Otter, Carlos Kleiber's Octavian in the performance of Der Rosenkavalier of Richard Strauss that he was conducting in Vienna when Dame Felicity Lott sang Die Marschallin. The few people who did get to know Carlos Kleiber found that he was vibrantly inspirational, not just in music.
We talked about literature, and we talked about Saki, the Victorian short story writer, who he was passionate about. We talked about The New Yorker, which we were both subscribers to, as being the finest example of weekly magazine written English. And we talked about scurrilous humour. And we got on famously.
He could and did have happy relationships with people whose devotion to music equaled his own. That was essential. But beyond that, there was also a Carlos Kleiber of immense learning. He was deeply, widely well-read in multiple languages. Towards the end of his life, he was teaching himself Portuguese. This is amazing. And it's Carlos. And people who grasped that about him enjoyed his company, and people who did not were sometimes afraid of his company.
He was a cultured man, and he didn't only know music. He knew other things, art, philosophy. He was extremely well read. How many languages he spoke. So you're in the presence of, is he a musician? Is he a writer? What is he? You couldn't really categorize him as a conductor. He is greater than that.
I think most especially it was in opera that Carlos Kleiber revealed his captivating personality so vibrantly to orchestras that were playing for him. The way he painted the pictures of the stage action and quoted and explained the texts, just exactly what the singers were singing and the kinds of characters they were interpreting, it was riveting. I was mesmerised by him when I rehearsed with him at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. And I was also disarmed by him when one day before a rehearsal, when I was practising just outside the orchestra pit, he approached me. In his very shy and charming way, he said, "I'm so sorry to disturb you. Can I just ask you something? Are you the man with the tapes whose house burnt down?" Well, I think it must have been the orchestra manager who'd told him that I was a collector of tape recordings, and many of them, in fact, had been damaged when my house had been struck by lightning several months earlier. So I told him, "My house didn't burn down, it was struck by lightning. I am a collector of tape recordings. Many of them have been damaged, but I have managed to rescue quite a lot of them. Oh, do you maybe have any of my father?" Well, that was a shock. I'd been told never to mention to Carlos Kleiber anything about his famous father, the conductor Erich Kleiber, as it was an extremely sensitive subject, and he could react very tempestuously if anyone tried to bring that up with him. And here he was asking me if I had any tapes of his father's live performances. Well, I did. They'd been recorded from radio broadcasts, actually of performances at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden in 1951, 1952 and 1953. So I told him that. "Oh, what are the operas you've got?" Der Rosenkavalier and Wozzeck. Wozzeck in 1952 and in 1953. "Oh, I don't have those. You couldn't make me copies, could you? You see, I'm now beginning to come to terms with my father." Well, in the second podcast of this series of 6 podcasts in which we're commemorating Carlos Kleiber, I related just why there was tension between Carlos and his father. And when I played for Carlos at Covent Garden in 1979 and 1980, I realised that many people there felt that, in a sense, he had never got his father's criticisms off his back. And especially that's because Kleiber Sr. had been held in tremendously revered regard, particularly at Covent Garden. Now, 23 years after his father's death, Carlos was alluding so openly about his troubles, and I found that touching and very disarming, especially as I do think that he actually never felt comfortable about the whole history with his father, right through his life.
I have the feeling so many times that he thought of himself that he was not very good, that his father was much better. And I remember in a discussion I said, "But I heard Le Nozze di Figaro with your papa, and I didn't like it very much." I said, "But you are much, much better than your papa, so do more." But it was not a very easy person. He had so many problems himself. I don't know. He was an introvert. I mean, if you wanted he's very quick coming into his own house and will come later out. He was very touchy.
And I think that surely that's why he was so distressed and so unnerved when, out of the blue, after the first and what was to be the last occasion that he conducted a concert in London with the London Symphony Orchestra, he received scathingly decimating reviews in the national newspapers the following day.
We did, sadly, only 2 performances, one in Milan and one in the Royal Festival Hall. To me, 2 of the most spectacular concerts I've ever taken part in. Unfortunately, the critics in London didn't take to the performances, and he vowed he would never conduct a symphony concert in England again. The amazing thing was that the entire orchestra was very excited by the concert. 3,000 people in the Royal Festival Hall leapt to their feet at the end of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, shouting and screaming for more. The critics somehow didn't like it, and he said, well, if that's the way they feel, then I'm not coming back.
As a ex-professional musician, if you look back over your career and you really try and pick out great performances, and you have difficulty finding more than 10. But that performance at the Festival Hall with Kleiber was absolutely unbelievable. I had never taken part in anything like that in my life. And I really could not believe what happened the following morning. I could not understand the critics. And I'd love to sort of go back and talk to one and say, well, why did you say that? Because he never, ever came back to conduct an orchestral concert in this case. He conducted opera, but he would never, ever come back. And I think that's been an extraordinary loss for this country to have missed that opportunity for that man. I can't understand why did they all say it. If it had been about performance, if it had not been together, of course, nothing is perfect in any concert. Nothing's perfect, and there were slip-ups. There are always slip-ups. But as an atmosphere, as a total performance, as an evening of music making, it was something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And I was absolutely shattered, as every member of the London Symphony Orchestra was, when we read those critics the following morning. And he never came back.
Robert Bourton mentioned the huge ovation from the audience. I think Carlos Kleiber did realise that he had a very special following with his audiences. But with his innate insecurity, he never felt confident or even trusting of any praise. And that, with his extreme sensitivity, accounted for why he felt the need for privacy, to the extent of being inaccessible, except to those few people he did trust and felt comfortable with. And even with them, he was reluctant.
He was a private man and didn't get involved in parties. But because we lived in Munich and I lived in Straslach, which was a mile away, a kilometre away from Grünwald where he lived, we used to meet every Saturday at the baker shop and buy our brötchen and have a chat. And I'd phone him up and sort of say, listen, why don't you come up and have tea or coffee, and I make some cake, or come up for dinner or something like that. Oh, no, Margaret, no, I don't want to, and that was Carlos. I'm sure that lots of people would have been only too happy to be friendly with him, not in a nasty way, but, to sort of give him some company and someone to talk to. But he just didn't, he didn't want that.
I think that was the tragedy of his person. That was the real tragedy. He suspected not only everybody, but also everything. Because once he said to me, during the rehearsals, I always said, and archivist, we always had to provide him with cigarettes and so, and we were talking all the time. And then on one point he said, everybody is that friendly to me. I cannot believe that they are decent people. Yeah. So why should they be that friendly to me?
The overture to Die Fledermaus was the very last music that Carlos Kleiber ever conducted. It was an encore at the end of his concert with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra on tour in Cagliari on the 26th of February 1999. 44 years earlier, on the 12th of February 1955, he had timidly appeared in public for the first time conducting Mülleker's operetta Gasparone at the Hans Otto Theatre in Potsdam. He didn't want anyone to know that he was Erich Kleiber's son, so he was billed as the conductor Karl Keller. His father sent him a telegram from the old Keller, and he conceded afterwards, with reluctance, that his son was talented. He couldn't have known that Carlos would become maybe the very most highly sought-after conductor of his time, and undoubtedly one of the most exceptionally influential and mesmerizing artists for virtually all those people who came into contact with him.
He literally breathed and sang with every singer, obviously knew the score backwards and forwards. You know, it's incandescent. It's a kind of music making that belies description. You can only try and be euphorically exaggerative, as I am being, for the listener to understand what it is like to be in the presence of someone that aware and that able.
It was an honor beyond imagination to get to know this man and to hear from him how he perceived music, how he lifted it from the page, and how he gave it to people in a way that will be eternally fresh and rewarding and imaginative and unique.